Hello, it's your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Flight podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Telegram, as well as supporting me on Subscribestar, Buy Me a Coffee, and Locals, and to check out the Substack, which also will be a adjoining Substack article to be released shortly as a complement to tonight's discussion, which is an after-action report on Dave the Distributist debate with Matt McManus on will joining the left help right-wing communities. So last week, of course, Dave had Matt McManus on to debate just that question after many months of Twitter arguments and spats. And it finally happened. Now, for full disclosure, Logos and I will not be going into the time period dealing with super chats. We watched the main actual discussion, so the first 2 hours. And we're going to limit more or less our analysis to those 2 hours. And yeah, okay, so the floor is yours, Logos.
All right. So the way I phrase this in the article I wrote for this is, let's suppose you're coming into this and you're madly interested, and you want a sequence of TLDRs for how this discussion went. So I have 3 TLDRs that get a little more detailed than the last, and then I say, okay, if you're still reading at this point, we'll do the whole conversation, analyze, and see what's going on. But here's the first TLDR you can get, right? If you just want like a 5-minute summary of what's going on here. Dave asked McManus a very important question. Forget the theory, forget the moralizing, forget all of it. Why should my audience want to join your side? That was the entire point of the discussion. That's why McManus is there. He's there to convince Dave and his audience that not that it's morally right to be a left-winger, but the world is better for them if the left-wingers win, regardless. Now, did McManus succeed in that goal? TLDR, no. There you go. There's your first TLDR. Matt McManus tries to, comes on to convince Dave that him and his would benefit from Matt winning. Matt fails spectacularly. Boom. There it is. Put a bow on it. That's your first TLDR. Okay, that's not super interesting because everybody can comment on that. So let's peel back a little bit and see what's going on there and why that happened. So the next TLDR I give is, I'm like, look, if you want to understand what happened here at a more subtle layer of analysis than just the silly things Matt said or some of the got-ems or whatever the usual debate analysis is, this is really a clash between 2 incompatible ethical theories. Matt McManus came at this debate as basically a deontological ethicist. He believes several things that are very common in the left. He believes that human beings are fungible in the moral sense, right? So any obligations you have to one human being, whether it's your sister, your neighbor, your coworker, you have to all human beings because they are all the same type of human. So somebody in Nicaragua should be just as morally valuable to you as your sister or your brother or your parents. That's one of the first deontological things McManus comes into the conversation with. The second one, which actually feels a lot more of the gotcha things that people were talking about after the conversation, is his primary duty to the state. He believes that the primary duty of the state is to ensure a power vacuum. So nobody can wield state power to crush this or that minority group. And that is the most fundamental thing for McManus. So Todd said we're not going to talk about the Q&A. We're going to limit our analysis to the first couple hours. But the one exception that I'll give is in the Q&A when the heroin versus like the neo mustache man group, I guess Todd might call them. McManus treating those
It's
two
for
groups
YouTube, Logos. It's for YouTube.
exactly. McManus treating them separately, right? Why does he give one a different treatment than the other? And the deontology, the state duties and stuff explains part of this interesting thing, but doesn't explain the whole thing. So the second TLDR of the conversation, if I want to put another bow on this, is Matt McManus never could have met Dave's challenge because Dave is coming at this from a consequentialist perspective. Why would the world be better if you win? Matt's coming at this from a deontological perspective. We don't care how the world looks. We have certain duties. I have them, and so do you. And so it's the moral good that I win, regardless of how the world looks after. And you can see several instances where Dave basically pushes Matt on this point indirectly during their conversation. but he doesn't really like force the issue. So one example would be Jordan Neely, should you take his drugs away and throw him in an asylum or something until he gets clean? It's like, well, no, right? He has to have the freedom to still do drugs. We just have to make it medically better if he does them. Well, what if you were Neely's parent? Would you want that for him? It's like, well, I don't know. There are several instances like that where that just came about. Dave asked Matt point blank, would you curtail pornography use? If not doing so, would basically create our civilization. Your birth rates plummet, everything just unravels, whatever. And Matt basically said, no uncertain terms, no, I'm not going to do that, even if it's socially deleterious if I don't do it. And that's why it's because he thinks that no matter what, the state has a certain principle to promote these liberties, and there you go.
Real
Okay,
quick, just for the sake of consistency,
sure.
we can also say that in the debate, he did say he personally disagrees with what Dave believes and some of what he does, but wouldn't use the state to coerce him to do what he thinks he ought to.
Correct. Absolutely. Yeah.
He did say that. He did say that. So in all fairness,
Matt's consistent there. Yeah, that's again part and parcel of Matt's view of the state as a duty to hold open the power vacuum. It's got to be held open for Dave, just as it is for the porn star, just as it is for the heroin addict, just as it is for all sorts of people. Matt's consistent about this. But what that means is if that duty is kind of like, sacred, you're not going to undermine it via some consequential appeal. And so this conversation was never going to materialize the way Dave hoped it would. Okay, so the third TLDR. Let's dive into this example of heroin and the very bad right-wing people a little further. Because it looked like Matt was being very, very inconsistent there, and he was. And so the third TLDR of the conversation will focus on this one. Why was he inconsistent here? Why was this inconsistency showing up in other places very subtly? To my mind, the inconsistency here happens like this. So another philosophical distinction we can make to peel back this next layer would be the distinction between what's called doxastic voluntarism and doxastic involuntarism. That's basically the idea in philosophy that you are ultimately responsible for or the chooser of your beliefs. So if a heroin addict wakes up one day and says, "Oh man, I got to get me a fix. I think I should, shoot up." The question is that heroin addict a slave to his addictions, and so he couldn't have done any differently, and so he's not responsible for trying to get that next fix, or is he ultimately responsible for his beliefs? Now, in that discussion, Matt McManus would say the heroin addict is a victim of a physiological medical state. He is not responsible for his urges in this instance, so he is doxastically involuntary with regard to those certain beliefs. Now, when you look at the quote really bad right-wing people, Matt has to say that they are voluntarily holding these beliefs. Now, that's interesting to me for a couple of reasons. So the first reason is physicalism and other kinds of very, very hard empiricism are very, very strong on the left. For a review of physicalism, in case you didn't see mine and Todd's discussion of philosophy of mind that happened a while ago, physicalism is basically the idea that you don't really have qualia beliefs and these other mental processes as things completely separate from the physiological things underneath of them. So if you hold political beliefs, your political beliefs in some sense just are products of the inner workings of your brain that you may not even fully understand, and we're still trying to understand as neuroscientists, speaking from that perspective. So if that's true, which a lot of people on the left would say it is, then the quote really bad right-wing people are in no position unique from the heroin addict. They are both, in some sense, slaves to these physical brain states, compelling them to believe certain things. But Matt could say, well, okay, a lot of people on the left do believe that, but I don't believe that. Okay, so why else would this be interesting? The other reason this is interesting is under a Marxist analysis, right? They believe in the historical or the scientific view of history. That's what I'm trying to say. Dialectical materialism. In some sense, um, ideas aren't a driving force on their own in history. And this is interesting because there was a little kerfuffle between them about um, whether or not Marxism underestimates ideology or not. And I think they kind of, crossed words about, what's going on there with underestimating ideology, but I'll foreshadow it here. The idea here is ideas and ideology in some sense are caused by material factors. So something about people's physical situations combined with what they know, their technology, so on, gets ideas into people's heads, and that's why they do it. So if this Marxist analysis is right, these quote really bad right-wing people, they they're the way they are because even if physicalism isn't true, they themselves are kind of captured by these physical historical processes. Maybe they were laid off, and so they're very, very suspect of mass immigration taking their jobs. Maybe they haven't had some certain educational opportunities, and so people are misleading them with statistics. That there are these physical historical facts, the sum total of which just explain why that person's here in a way that you can't just look at the person and say, well, you're obviously choosing your beliefs, right? Stop doing that. Stop being a bad person. It just doesn't make sense at that level of analysis. And listening to the conversation, it seemed to me that McManus had it. So this leads McManus to a really interesting inconsistency here. If he ends up being forced to think of these two things as very, very similar, being caused by these underlying physical processes, making both people in some sense victims, rather than, idea choosing perpetrators, that's bad for him because McManus will be the first to tell you, as he told Dave, that, that these quote really bad right-wing people are abhorrent. They are inhumane. They're disgusting. They are words that he would not use to describe a heroin addict. And the state probably should do something to minimize them. But like Todd mentioned earlier, McManus isn't going to ask the state to use force to crush his political enemies. So we have a problem. In some sense, the state wants to limit them like you'd manage heroin addiction. On the other hand, the state can't limit them like they limit heroin addiction because you're talking about limiting like a medical issue and alleviating that for a person versus a state managing an idea. Now, one of the reasons why I think I almost call him Ben Burgess, Matt McManus has this libertarianism about the state. You have to leave this power vacuum open. I think a big part of it comes from the whole what if the rules were reversed trope that you see on modern conservatives, right? So if somebody McManus doesn't like gets that ring of power and brings the state to bear on him, that'd be awful. And so making the Kantian argument, he's like, well, everybody would be hard done by if the state came at them. So let's nobody do it, basically. And so he can't. He can't have the state regulate them in the same way the state would try to regulate or manage like a heroin epidemic going on in society. It just wouldn't work, which leaves Matt with that inconsistency that he has to treat both sides as unequally at fault about their situations or their beliefs, because to do otherwise would undermine Matt's kind of core ideology about the state and what its duties are. And so that's going to be the result of where a whole bunch of the inconsistencies are going to pop up for this conversation. So if TLDR 1 is Matt failed at the goals of the debate, he didn't even try really to consequentially win Dave's audience over. TLDR 2 is he couldn't have done so because he's a deontologist and Dave gave him a consequentialist challenge. Good luck. And so 3 is going to be a lot of the inconsistencies pop up because they are core tensions between treating views and other things as involuntary, meaning the state should and shouldn't regulate them, like say heroin addictions. And so this is where these are coming from. So that's like my first big picture summaries of the discussion.
Right. So you were saying that Matt, you're assuming that Matt is a Marxist, but he said he was a liberal socialist. So, I mean, he did use Marx, admittedly, yes. But
yeah, I don't think he's a full-on Marxist, but I do. I mean, if you notice, take any issue, whether it's porn, whether it's child, birth rates, whether it's the economy, whether it's any conversation noted in the topic. How do we solve it? Matt always said, well, it's the economy. right? So he might not be a full-blown
Sure.
Marxist, but I think he believes enough of the dialectical materialist, things are products of their physical conditions view, um, that they're functionally indistinguishable in most cases.
Right. Yeah. The sort of economic determinism does seem to belie some sort of reliance on Marxism.
Yes. So putting it another way, what Matt would say, to be consistent with his other solutions to other problems, is, well, we have a bad right-wing person epidemic in society. We have to fix that by fixing their economic conditions, which does not put him in a very good place with his friends on the left, right? Why do you want to make these people's lives so much better? But that's how he fixes all the other problems. So there you go.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that if you listen to Matt's position, and this actually is sort of relevant to a debate that Keith and I had on Modern Day Debate with Ben Burgess and Brenton Lengel, where it's not entirely clear these people are socialists at all in any sort of historic sense. So, Keith did his mic drop where he's like, I'm older than you kids, and you're not socialists at all. Now, but how does this relate to Matt McManus? Well, he says the main problem with NAFTA was that the U.S. subsidized corporations and outcompeted the Mexicans rather than competing at the same level. Well, even absent U.S. government subsidies, the United States has a higher level of capitalization, full stop. So even without U.S. subsidies, they'd still be more efficient than their Mexican counterparts on a socialist model. And then two, the socialist objection to NAFTA would actually be that the jobs are going overseas so that, the workers at home don't have the race to the bottom, basically, which is a large part of the anti-globalist left narrative that culminated in 2011 with Occupy Wall Street. The other thing, too, is this idea of open borders. At one point, Matt McManus tells Dave, well, the problem is not immigration per se, but low unionization rates. Well, right, but those are connected because The Verge getting a heat map, which was gained from Business Insider, Whole Foods, owned by Amazon, is that they track diversity based on gender and ethnicity, and they argue that it's at higher risk of unionization if there's a low diversity score. So it's pretty clear that Amazon is tracking this in order to create a divided workplace. This is something that again, let's also look at socialists before 2000, before 1990. They would have all been for closed borders. The Soviet Union didn't have open borders. North Korea doesn't have open borders. And in the United States, the IWW, the AFL-CIO, and the Knights of Labor all were supportive of immigration restrictions. And I'm just saying, how is this not a kind of left libertarianism?
Yeah, it's exactly right. I mean, to do you one better, 2016 Bernie Sanders in that Vox interview, called, was it Vox or was it, darn it, I have to look it up. I don't remember who he interviewed with. He did an interview where he said in the interview that open borders was a Koch brothers conspiracy meant to basically hurt labor.
Yes.
That's 2016. That's Bernie Sanders. I mean, in 2020, he kind of flipped on that because his bidders kind of like, no, you can't say that anymore, Bernie. And so he's kind of like, done. But even as late as 2016, there's a big contingent of the left that was like, I don't know about this immigration stuff. That's a big issue. So here's the big difference. And this is why it's really, really difficult to talk about, like, quote, the left. Like, should the right care if the left wins? Do better for them if the left wins? There are at least two lefts. And what we'll have to get to, like, what is a right winger, what is a left winger, because that part of the discussion needs some commentary. We'll do that later, of course. But, like, one of the big dividers in the left, in my opinion, is what I'm going to call, like, the philosophical idealist left versus, like, the kind of practical, the practical left. The biggest difference between them is that the ideal left doesn't fully appreciate things like constraints or diminishing returns or any of these practical economic matters that kind of get in the way of the world as they want it to be. Whereas the practical left is like, yeah, duh, there are constraints. You can't help everybody. So who can we build a revolution around? Who can we kind of get to work together to fix some social changes we want. And like, what's feasible to do right now, which interestingly enough is what Dave kept asking McManus. Now, McManus is definitely more on the ideal left in the sense that he believes in these duties. We have these duties. We're not going to fully fix the problems until we've lived up to our duties in the fullest sense. It's exactly why, whatever the problem was, the causal arrow of this problem is something like problem, immediate symptoms, caused by local economic issues, caused by national economic issues, caused by global economic issues. And so what's going to solve the problem ultimately for McManus? Well, what's going to solve the problem ultimately is changing the world, basically. Once you get down to brass tacks, your problem, whether it's porn, homelessness, housing, whatever, that problem is not going to get fixed until you literally change the entire world to be the way Matt McManus wants it to be. And that's why. This is why he's not the traditional left we've been talking about. Though the old left had sense. They were Machiavellians in some sense. They're like, here's what we can get done. And a lot of the new left is just, they write books, basically. It's what they do. They write books.
Well, okay, so yeah, I've talked about this before in other contexts. What I would argue is my TLDR of this contextualizing is in the United States, in North America, the original labor left, say in its heyday from like 1870 to 1935, was a serious threat contending with capital. And then basically a series of counter gangs were created, i.e. fake left, which the most famous example would be the Congress for Cultural Freedom by the CIA in 1950. And then that becomes the new left, the cultural left, the woke left. Now, part of this is inspired by the work of Caleb Maupin and his Bread, Tooth, Stars, Imperialism. I think I would trace it earlier in history than he does. But nonetheless, I think we can say that the new left, the cultural left, is a counter gang to disrupt and psyop the old left, which is based on economics. But the other thing that's just strange to say is, so Matt McManus said to Dave in the debate about immigration, he said that, well, the migrants coming over the border are a downstream effect from NAFTA, which had them lose their jobs because the U.S. Subsidized American firms. Well, that's a really strange argument, right? So let's say you have a boat, okay? And somebody's actively drilling holes in the boat. And there's also somebody that's patching up holes in the boat. And then Matt's like, no. You can't patch up the holes in the boat until we stop the guy from drilling holes in it. But it might be that stopping up the holes buys you enough time to stop the guy drilling them.
Well, exactly. Yeah, that's a pretty good analogy. I mean, the example I always use is housing. We have places that have had like 90% plus occupancy for decades, and when you have occupancy rates that high, there's never an incentive to raise rents ever. I saw Facebook post bragging on Twitter or Reddit. I don't remember which. Somebody shared some Facebook post of some like real estate guy that was just like, yeah, we succeeded in raising our rents by 50% compared to last year. And we kicked out all the tenants that couldn't pay. Things are going awesome, basically. And like stuff like that's going all over the country. That doesn't happen unless you have housing demand that is so far outstripping supply that it's absolutely crazy. Now, should we fix some international problems? We probably should fix some international problems. Are we going to be able to do it in our lifetimes? Probably not. If your solution to the problem is, hey, let's just like shut down the CIA so they stop screwing with other countries, it's like, eventually you'd probably like to. But in the meantime, maybe working people should not be living paycheck to paycheck just to pay rent, because then they can use that extra time for organizing. And with that extra time for organizing, then they can actually enact other changes, right? You have to build a snowball effect. You have to like get victories to get more victories to get more victories. And if we're stuck in this whole quagmire of we have to wait until the world fixes itself before we do anything about the fact that your rent is like 60% of your paycheck or whatever crazy things are going on, right? You're just screwed. There's nothing you can do.
Well, yeah, it's not calculated to work. Now, and I think that's partly what shows the ersatz nature of the new left. I mean, again, stopping up the holes is a precondition to buying enough time to equipping people to stop the guy from drilling the holes in the boat in the first place. Is there anything else you wanted to say about housing prices and immigration? Because that's sort of your pet peeve.
I mean, not really. Not if I'm evaluating a debate like this. I mean, in my article that I wrote, basically the idea is it's just one more topic in a string of topics where I noticed that McManus just kind of went, problem, local economic solution, national economic solution. We must fix the world to fully fix the problem. Um, I don't know if this is going to come up later, so maybe I'll just say it now. Um, One thing I find annoying about that is it just kind of makes the progressive hypothesis unfalsifiable. And in fact, I call it Schrodinger's progressive solution because you know how I love to attach Schrodinger to things where knock out mold bug. The idea is it's like, well, has a progressive solution even been fully implemented yet? Well, I don't know. Have we changed the entire world, right? Well, if you fix the whole world, by definition, you've kind of fixed any problems downstream from fixing, the world, because every problem is a problem in the world. And if no, then you haven't actually got a true progressive solution, right? So it puts you in a situation where it's just like you can never tell if progressive solutions are being implemented because you can never tell if the whole world's fixed. And so whenever you want to be like, hey, I think I found some data that shows things aren't going right here, they can always appeal to this global problem and say, well, here's why the data isn't working, which basically makes their hypothesis unfalsifiable. Now, people on the left that are more empirically minded or whatever, they should really consider that because that's a big problem. And as far as a consequential problem for Dave's audience, I mean, that should annoy them. It's like, well, what do we get out of this if you win? I don't know. We'll tell you when we fix the world. It's like, well, I don't like what I'm seeing so far. I'm using induction. I'm using whatever I can to see where things are going. I don't like it. Well, only 20% of progressives being implemented, which is basically the same as zero, because until we fix the whole world, none of it matters. So whether we implement 20, 40, 60, or 80% progressivism, it's all kind of identical in the sense that the world hasn't been fixed yet. So you'll never know. So in a sense, it makes it so Dave's audience can't try before they buy. They can't get a little sample and see, hey, do I want society to be more or less like this? No, you have to let progressives fix the whole world and see what happens. But if they have the power to fix the whole world, it's impossible to have buyer's remorse and say, no, wait, I take it back. I take it back. You've given them such a degree of hegemony at that point that it's impossible to do anything and go back, which is like the absolute last place that McManus should want to put that audience in.
But also, how even if they had all the power, how on his model could they fix the world? Since doing anything would actually just be using state power to oppress people.
Yes, I actually pointed that out in the article as well. Yeah, that's it. They want to have states be weak enough to never get in the way of individuals doing individual stuff, whether it be porn or heroin or whatever, but yet such a fine-tuned degree over global trade that you can stop any country from kind of circumventing the progressive economic solution. You cannot have a state that has power at those different dynamics. It's impossible.
Right. I think here's where a key difference between Dave and Matt McManus is developing. Matt seems to think that if you fine tune the economy just right, see, because he makes a distinction in the kinds of sexual exhibitionism, people that are driven into it due to economic need, which is bad, and then people that would freely choose to do it as self-expression. So he's like, if we can fine tune the economy such that the only people who do this are those people that choose to do it, then that's fine, because none of them are driven by economic necessity to do it. And then Dave was like, no, they just shouldn't be allowed to do it at all. But then what I would say is what's weird about this is if there's nothing wrong from Matt's point of view with that kind of behavior in principle, what does it matter morally if they're driven to it due to financial need or choice?
Basically, Matt's principle is there's nothing wrong with the behavior if they choose to do it. And so all fixing the economy is going to do is kind of ensure that whoever's doing it is choosing to do it. And then on Matt's view, it's right because they chose it.
Okay. I mean, okay. That's just libertarianism. I mean, like,
yes,
it's just libertarianism. So the other thing is we've talked about what we thought about Matt's performance. I know you have some stuff to say on Dave's performance, and we can move into that now.
Yeah. So for Dave's performance, this is kind of interesting. We were talking about this the night of the debate, so I'll start here. We were both kind of frustrated to the degree to which Dave would kind of like jump around. between topics. And as I was kind of like reviewing this and watching it again and going over the fine tooth comb, the frustration hit me again. It's just like Dave had a good chance to like really rake Matt over the coals on this one, and it looks like he's like jumping a topic. That's one thing I noticed. However, as I pointed out, like the night of the debate, something occurred to me. It's like, whose debate is this to win or lose? Well, it's Matt's debate to win or lose. He's the one that has to convince Dave's audience of such and such. And what happens if the conversation jumps around to such a larger degree that nothing ever gets resolved, right? No points finished. There's no light at the end of the tunnel for Dave's audience. Well, that's Matt's failure, right? So in some sense, as frustrating as it is for me that the thing jumped around so much. Tactically speaking, I can't exactly say it was a bad tactical move on Dave's part if he wanted to win. If his goal is just to make Matt look like no matter which angle you go from, there's no light at the end of the tunnel for Dave's audience in wanting the left to win here. At least, Matt McManus's version of the left to win. Jumping around does a good job of that because nowhere did any resolution happen that Dave's audience would be happy with. As much as I would have went for, preferred Dave go for the kill shot on a few topics.
So right there, I'm going to put a bookmark because this is actually an important point. Later, okay, now I'm going to refer to one super chat because we actually talked at the very first super chat before we stopped watching, where the one guy said, "I'm a straight white Christian male. Well, how will I find a place on the left?" And Matt McManus said, "Oh, I'm all those things." Well, we'll just take him at his word, and he said that he's okay with that. He's, they're fine with him. And he said, the key here, the operative word he used was, if you're arguing in good faith, people on my side will listen to you, talk to you, and respect you. But here's the thing, right? If he's not, able to engage with Dave on that level, it's almost like if we're going to use a deontological Kantian ethic, then you ought to act in good faith on the same level with your opponent. And it's pretty clear at that point that you're not.
Yeah.
Because right, Dave sort of demonstrates, whether this is intentional or not, that Matt McManus is his because he's a deontologist. He has to be consistent throughout, right? That's what he's committed himself to. Yet he's clearly not doing that by the end. He's got one set of reasonable for him, and then another set for the other guys, because like you said, oh, well, just wait till we take over the world, and then you'll see how good it is for you. Even though right now it looks pretty bad. It just seems to be bad faith.
Yeah, exactly. And that's part of the inconsistency I try to cover with my third TLDR.
Real quick, Logos, here we go. Dave just said something here. Referring to you. You're right, I jump around my philosophies to get admission, then move on, not twist the knife.
That's fair enough. That's a difference in debate tactics. And it's like I said, tactically speaking, if the goal is to kind of like play around and make sure that like Matt can't resolve the thing pretty good because it's more of a debate than a discussion, then that's fair. And I'm not in Dave's head, so I don't know like how he was treating it. But like I said, do that first night, it's like, depending on Dave's prep, it could go either way.
Right. So your next point, Lewis?
Yeah, the next point. So the other thing that I found interesting was so this is one of the big questions that I find really interesting for this one. Maybe okay, this might be easier to organize if I combine this with the next topic. The difference between the left and right. So I reviewed Dave's definition of the right in the debate, and I had one that I kind of preferred a little bit more. I think we talked about this when we thought it was pretty good, and so I'm going to go into that, and this will kind of explain where I think things are coming from. So the definition of right wing that I'd like to use here that I think really forces McManus into contrast goes like this. People on the right, I think, have three big differences with people on the left. The first one is that people aren't fungible, i.e. easily replaceable by other people. And this is in all regards. This is ethical, this is practical, this is whatever. You have a different obligation to your family, to your neighbor, to the people at your church than you do to people halfway around the world from you. You can't just swap them and pretend you have the same obligations. You can't swap people and pretend you're going to get the same output out of them. So a lot of the left like to talk about statistical results. If there's statistical disparities, we have like an obligation to, fix them and so on and so forth. The right doesn't look at human beings like individual statistic metrics that we get to like tune. They have their people basically, and they can't help but think of them that way. The second difference is there's no growth without cost. I think Dave will agree with this one in a big way. The wording of this one's kind of inspired by I don't remember which video it was exactly he did. Um, I think it was his speech that he gave where he was talking about how the left's vision for society and how you can end up in like this technologically advanced, in theory should be a utopia, but it ends up being like this crazy dystopia. Um, so basically what's going on right now is massive, advances in technology are helping us grow and grow and grow. And so the left can kind of frame the arguments that it wants in terms of growth. And to be fair, the right can do it too. So when you look at immigration in like the normie academic circles, the most common metric I always see immigration talked about in terms of is like GDP, right? Immigration, does raising it, lowering it, whatever, affect national GDP? Yeah, if GDP goes up, it's good. That's a very like growth mindset, and that you can always just kind of like suck blood from the stone and grow and grow and grow. But that growth isn't permanent, and it always comes with costs, basically, is I think what the right would say in that. The third thing is hierarchies and social expectations existed for a reason, and the reasons cannot be smoothed over by technology indefinitely. So one example of this I give in my article is firearms and how they've kind of affected expectations of warfare. So back, before guns, the military obviously was segregated. It was mostly men. You had to be heavy, carry a lot of heavy armor, equipment. Being taller and more, muscular and more imposing could give you a big advantage on the battlefield when you're dealing with melee combat and so on. But as you see firearms creeping in, you start, seeing defense become a bit more egalitarian because all kinds of people can use firearms. Now, on the one hand, that's good. As Colt says, God made man, Colt made them equal, is the example that I use for that. But there's a knock-on effect there. And the knock-on effect is, well, if everybody can be deadly with a firearm, so can a child. Think about that a second. There's a school shooting problem right there. So the technology that makes warfare, self-defense, and so on egalitarian comes with a bunch of butterfly effects. And this happens basically for any technology you can think of, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's the birth control pill, whether it's whatever. So the right complains about, say, the sexual revolution. And one of the core complaints about that is, sure, we've got this great technology called the birth control pill, but here's all the knock-on effects the right is seeing from this. What the left is seeing, look, we have technology to make things more equal. What the right's seeing is, hey, we have these knock-on effects. And so the social problems we had that demanded hierarchies and norms and mores and so on, that technology is smoothing over, it can't keep working indefinitely because it's creating problems of its own. And so those are the really big things that I think of in the definition of the right. But for this one, I want to focus on like the first one. So this is a jugular I kind of wish Dave would have went for on the immigration thing. This, I think, would have just like shattered the debate, really put things into focus, and just like forced everybody in the audience to like jarringly make a choice. It's very clear that in McManus's argument for immigration, we have to fix the world first. It's because McManus believes that we have a moral obligation to every human being equally. That is like either implicit or even explicit in some of the arguments he was making. Now, I just wonder what would have happened in the conversation if Dave would have just said, "Hey, listen, right? I just disagree with you that we have symmetric moral obligations to all humans equally. I don't think my audience thinks that their life, somebody in Honduras' life needs to be made better before theirs can, or something like that, right? We just reject that premise, Matt. And if what you're going to say is we have to fix the world before we can fix this because we have this moral obligation, we're just going to deny the obligation. Now what, right? Your job coming on the stream was to figure out how the left winning could make the lives of my audience better. And if what you're saying is, well, you actually have a duty not to care about that because the world's problems, how is that not disqualifying for Matt McManus? What he has to do is basically admit flat out, okay, I fail. I can't win your challenge. You have the duty to make the world's lives better. And so we're done. We've now reached the impasse. We can put a bow on this. There will be no synthesis here. And that's also where I think the interesting thing it goes. The entire point is synthesis. How can the left and right synthesize if the things that separate them aren't merely, say, degrees of tactics or degrees of aesthetics or something like that, but are legit contradictions, right? If you have P and not P separating the two factions, you're not going to get, if the law of the excluded middle is true, you're not going to find a middle ground there. It's either the case that we have equal obligations to every other human being on the planet, the exact same ones, or it's the case that due to constraints and other practical concerns, we can't. Ought implies can, and we cannot have the same moral obligation to everybody on the planet. And because of those two things being literal negations of each other, if the goal is to find a synthesis with the left, as far as I'm concerned, that's going to be impossible.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing that I'd say is, depending on how you want to look at debate as a form, do you either go for the knockout blow against an argument, or do you, as you speculated, and then we've had Dave further confirm, that you get people to admit? Well, I mean, I think in one sense you can do both. Like, it's not either or in one sense, because each has a place in an appropriate context. And so when Logos, you and I argue we wish Dave had done more knockout blows, that's not to say not at the exclusion of any other strategy, because I think these two strategies can be married together, and good debaters will do both. They'll get someone to admit something that looks damning to the other side, and they'll also attack the other side's position. And so one area where this really comes up, and where I wish Dave had gone further, was the idea with the normalization of the Rainbow Coalition. Now, Dave is correct when he says that it was for normies, those on the street, was TV shows. I think Dave mentioned Will and Grace. But the other thing is, that's not going far enough back, right? If you go all the way back to the sexual revolution and where it came from, it's, again, I would argue, a counter gang to dilute the left. Rockefeller's Institute, or the Rockefeller Foundation, funded the Kinsey Institute, Alfred Kinsey, which founded in 1947 in Bloomington, Indiana. He then writes his H-bomb book, Sexual Behavior of the Human Male. We're in Table 34. We have evidence that he did some very awful criminal activity, which I recommend that everybody look up. Judith Reisman in the 80s would go around and point to that same table. Nobody seems to care. So two things. If you can point to Table 34 and someone on the left doesn't object to that or doesn't deal with that, that's a huge loss of face, because you've basically sided with criminal behavior. Even today, that would be considered criminal behavior, what we find on that table. And then second of all, it shows, because what someone like Matt would say, and someone on the left would say, is that this is an organic process of the people. That's what I heard from the propaganda about the 60s, on all the different cultural issues, when in fact, most of this stuff had either corporate or deep state backing. And in the case of the sexual revolution, it was corporate with Kinsey.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think that's really, really important if you want to put a contrast with it was grassroots activists that kind of like changed things. I don't think it was quite grassroots activists that really changed things. That could get quagmired pretty quickly, but it does go to show that if there are plausible, like, capitalistic origins of this thing, that the left might overlook it in its war against capitalism because, well, the end results are good. I mean, it's got some value for that. But since you brought that up, I mean, this is a really interesting part of the debate as well. Here's one dimension of the conversation I think would have been really interesting. So when I listened to that again today, Dave took the position that, like, give me the media, I'll change public opinion. Like, the media is kind of causing all this. And McManus took kind of like the opposite position. Well, actually, it's not fair, because McManus hedges a lot. He always says things like, well, that's not necessarily true. One could say that, blah, blah, blah. So I don't want to say that Matt, like, hardline took the opposite position, but he said, well, somebody could argue the opposite position. Okay, fine. And it's all activists. Now, one thing I think is really interesting about this, in a dynamic that should be investigated, is if you want to Alinsky the right on this one, right? If you want to jujitsu the right's principles to get them to accept something, I think there has to be a grain of truth to what McManus is saying. And the grain of truth goes like this. The right believes implicitly or explicitly in, like, these spheres of responsibility. You're more responsible to your family than to your neighbors, than to your, like, community, than blah, 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 blah. Now, let's suppose you have somebody on the right and they're seeing Will and Grace, these coastal elite people, whatever. Now, if that show is kind of preachy, they can kind of ignore it in the sense that it's coming from people whose values are coming from far outside their sphere of influence. They might as well be watching some African show about values in Africa or something. Not quite, because they're still American, but you get the idea. However, if you're a Linskyite, you want to flip this. What you want to do is you want to force a dilemma on the right within their spheres of responsibility. So what you really have to do is you have to get activists that are more local than not. And so this is where it's really valuable for the left if like some conservatives kid comes out as gay or something, because now they're forced into a dilemma. This is now within their ultimate sphere of responsibility. They can't just kind of like mentally compartmentalize this as, oh, that's how those funny liberals live in New York or something. Now, either I have to, meet my familial bonds by helping my family member do what they want. Maybe they want legislation passed. They want DOMA repealed. They want whatever. Or this is so inconsistent with my values, I now have to deal with the fact that this person is in my family claiming to be this anathema thing. And so you'll see things on both accounts. You'll see people that like disowning their kids for being gay. You'll also see people flipping and saying, you know what? Family over sacredness, basically, to put it in quasi-Heidean terms, right? That the family is more important than the sacred. So maybe I've got to flip and I've actually got to like either help my kin or at least stand back and let them do things like on this issue. So the media is not nothing. I think McManus tries too hard to discount the media, but activists aren't nothing either, especially if they're your children.
Let's telescope this out as a causal chain of events. I think if we look at both Dave and Matt are looking at a part of the truth, but what I would argue is this, and tell me if you agree, Logos. We start this with corporate foundation funding, and we know that the Kinsey Institute was funded by the Rockefellers, and it was his quote scientific research unquote, which include criminal activity. Table 34 says that this is scientific now. Now people in high places start doing two things. They start repealing the laws. Remember, the laws had to already be basically dead letters before any of this could happen, because you'd go to jail. And using their wealth and privilege, something they're not supposed to do if you're a leftist, using your wealth and privilege to create content that pushes for this. Okay, now we're at stage 2, the content phase. That's where Dave's looking at. And then when there's a critical mass of that behind the legalization, you then get to the activists, which is what Matt McManus is talking about. But before you can have either of those two, you have to have the corporate backing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And one thing that's kind of interesting, now that I'm thinking about this, I think I'm actually going to put this in my article. I mean, I have it written, but now I'm going to add some stuff in as I'm thinking about this. The left talks about stochastic terrorism quite a bit, right? I mean, that's one of their biggest buzzwords today. Flip the idea of stochastic terrorism on this topic, basically. Matt can't downplay the effect of media on this if we can build a plausible stochastic relationship between mass broadcasting certain messages and themes and kids that could see this media randomly cause tension within the family. So the even if Matt wants to downplay the media relationship between this via the stochastic terrorism meme the left has these days, he knows where the connection would be coming from. So yeah,
right, he does. And this is another, I think, limitation or failure that we see in these kinds of discussions. There is a kernel of truth to what both sides are saying about how this happened. I mean, if it was completely fictitious and a lie, no one would believe it. But what I notice is that you have to step way, way back in order to see the source here. Now, admittedly, this is hard to do, and most people don't have that knowledge or inclination. But the other thing that I find very, very suspicious is my entire life, what has the left ever said? Follow the money, follow the money. And yet when it comes to all of these issues, they never follow the money. Because the money leads to Rockefeller, their mortal enemy. That's the problem. The money trail goes back to Rockefeller.
Yeah, exactly. And this comes down to one of the problems they have too, because they like the libertine consequences of where things end up. They don't like the genesis of how things got here. And so what's going to be easy enough for them to do is just say, well, maybe it didn't start out from the best of places, but genetic fallacy, we're just gonna water under the bridge and move on. It doesn't matter how we got here. Saying where we are now is wrong because of how it started. That's a genetic fallacy. We're not going to care about that. And we're just going to keep this as the status quo because it's
Well,
better
hold
than
on, right there. Their entire argument against the right goes away then.
Yes,
because
yes,
their entire follow the money is a genetic fallacy. Then, if they're going to say that,
yes.
Can they actually say that? Their entire argument against the right collapses.
No. But again, we've already found several places that they're inconsistent and why they're inconsistent. Like, there's just some issues. You just look at it and go, yeah, they kind of have to be inconsistent here, given all the things they kind of have to believe. So yeah, it's at this point, it's just kind of like not even interesting to me once you look at it and just go, yeah, of course.
Right. But see, this actually, I think, supports my argument that the sort of countergang New Left, and the CIA was behind this too with the Congress for Cultural Freedom. So it's a tandem security state corporate angle. These people are now saying, don't do anything until we can already save the world, which basically completely neuters them as any possible opposition force.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that proof of the theory?
You'd think.
You'd think. Yeah. You'd think. So yeah, then that's broadly, I think, where you and I would wish that Dave had been a little more forceful. Not that, he didn't win, not that it's not effective to get people to admit things. I would just love to see one of these socialists in a debate. See table 34 projected onto the screen and then react to that. That's the ultimate admission confession.
Yeah, kinda. They're just gonna quagmire it. They're just gonna backtrack it. They're just gonna say, yeah, okay, Kinsey was horrible. Well, here's the most frustrating thing about this, and you kind of know this because of some of your experiences with left-wing debates, right? What the left will say and admit to in the context of a debate when it's tactical isn't always what they'll say when they're with their friends.
Oh,
And so,
Sargon pointed that out when he debated the guy from, what was it? It was like 5-6 years ago with I can't think of it now. We watched it together, remember?
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about, but it's been too long.
It's been too long.
Yeah, so it's like, even if all they have to say in the debate to kind of like brush that off is just like, wow, that's terrible. I didn't know. See, this is why capitalism
Minority
is bad.
Report. That was it. Sam Cedars Majority Report.
Oh yeah.
That was it. Sargon, remember, Sargon was debating one of the guys on the Majority Report, and they were playing that game. Oh, the guy sounds terrible. Who are you talking about?
Yeah.
And Sargon's like, you know who I'm talking about? No, I don't. Tell me.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and so all they have to do in the debate is just say, oh, that Kinsey, that sounds terrible. This is all the terrible things capitalism does. This is why you should be on my side. We got to stop that big bad capitalism, whatever. And then, once they leave the debate, it's no longer a prescient thing they have to be an activist about. And so it's, just tactically agree and move on and note that it probably won't come back to bite you again.
Well, so far it hasn't, because the right doesn't use this aggressively enough.
They're starting to.
They're starting to. Yeah.
I was watching Destiny's channel, and him and somebody else were doing a review of Matt Walsh's documentary. And that was the only time I got to see the documentary, at least mostly in full, because like he was like doing it and reviewing it and clipping it and whatever. And he actually had Kinsey and John Money. He had table 34 in the documentary. He had John Money, an explanation of that in the documentary. Mm-hmm. So I think these things are getting there on the right. Half of me is optimistic about that. Half of me is pessimistic about that. So, the optimistic half of me is saying, yeah, we can kind of like really, show people where they started and kind of like doing more in your face things. So people can't hide, it's something like the best disinfectant, put slime light on it. There you go. The pessimistic half of me says, well, the boomer cons, and not all boomers are boomer cons, right? Like I'd say Matt Walsh is in some ways still kind of boomer conish, even if he means well in certain topics. They have a tendency to grab a meme and just kind of like overuse it, right? Tell me if you've heard this before, right? What if the roles were reversed?
Oh boy,
man, those left, they sure are hypocrites. So one of the worries I have about this getting more into right-wing parlance is that it ends up kind of like that, where the magnitude of the narrative being painted kind of gets lost in how overused it gets in the discussions. Um, I don't know how to solve that problem because it's a terrible problem. Things like this should be talked about,
Well,
but we have that problem.
Yeah, what's interesting is I thought you were going to bring up this problem. The optimism pessimism that I have is that there are people on the left who, so we've already had a big sussing out after the start of the Ukraine war and COVID. So we have Jimmy Dore and Max Blumenthal who still are true to their principles, fighting Wall Street, fighting the U.S. military state, and then the rest that don't, and they sort of got sifted out by these experiences. I was thinking, well, how's the left going to respond to this? I think we'll see a similar sussing out. There'll be what we might call the dupes on the left, the people that meant well but just didn't know enough, and then there'll be the people that don't care because they're paid for by some foundation or government organization or university, and they don't have to care.
Exactly. Yeah.
The other thing that's interesting, and really this underpins your point about fungibility. And it's completely dishonest. There's one point in the conversation, where Dave is trying to put an exclamation point on the fact that we have to look at these sexual addictions issues holistically, because Dave says that sex produces children, and Matt says not if you use contraception. Okay, so there's a world that we can envision where there's no sexual costs by using antibiotics, contraception, and other things. They assume that's normative when it's never been normative until 60 years ago. And then they act like anything short of that is oppression, even when it was inconceivably impossible.
Yeah, and that gets to my third prong of the right-wing definition, right? Old social norms, mores, whatever, cannot be replaced or smoothed over by technology forever without consequences. And that's basically what this is getting to.
Well, I mean, we're already seeing it now, right? Because Dave brought up another good point with Matt, that these blue cities are falling apart. Like, you can't blame the Republicans for this. They've been doing it your way for the last 60 years. And look at these cities. They're just falling apart. Drug addiction, homelessness, crime. And the only solution is don't do anything. It's like, well, no, we'll just give them, drugs under supervision. They've been trying to do that like in Portland and Oakland for years. It doesn't work.
Right. So soon they're going to start saying, Canada might be onto something, right? I read an article a couple days ago.
Oh, that's next. Yeah.
Yeah. I read an article a couple days ago where Canada was recommending, no, it was a survey. And I think it was something like 2/3 of Canadians or whatever. I'd have to look at the survey. It was an alarmingly large number are okay with the government recommending suicide for homeless people, like euthanasia. And yeah, if the first wave of things don't work out, that's the second one. And I'm still trying to figure out how to articulate this, because the left accuses the right of being social Darwinian so much. But if you look at it, what do we have going on here? We have this view that says, like, all people are fungible. We have these moral duties to everybody. So we have to bring in all these immigrants to make their lives better. Now, because that happens, housing prices are just going to go up. It's just a thing. Work is going to be hard to come by as you pack more and more people into these tiny little cities and make them kind of like compete for jobs, resources, and whatever. You're going to get a bunch of winners and losers. And now at the end of it, we see this thing where it's just like, okay, a lot of people, it turns out, are okay with just, euthanizing the losers. It's like, what is that? That's textbook social Darwinism.
Yeah, it is.
It is. Now, on the one hand, just as I said, like, the left is hard to categorize earlier, so is the right. When the left says, like, the right are social Darwinians, they're more talking about, like, the libertarian-minded right. Just let free markets do whatever, no safety nets, let the chips fall where they may. It's like, okay, fair enough. I can see how, you'd argue for that being socially Darwinian. But, like, Dave's obviously a reactionary. So he has a lot of high ground here to be like, I actually don't want a world like that, but, like, look at the world, your stuff is leading to, And that's another question, I think.
No, but that follows naturally, though, from Matt, because Matt was saying the whole time, they kept on saying, well, so you're telling me that as long as people freely choose, they can freely choose to harm themselves. And Matt says yes. So the ultimate form of choosing self-harm is choosing your own death.
Yeah, exactly.
You had another point to make, sorry.
Oh no, I think that was mostly it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because I wanted to jump on that. That was really important. So I think that covers most of what we wanted to say. Is that right, Logos?
I think so. Let me look through my notes real quick.
Well,
And
while you do that, I'm going to go with our one super chat. Mutant number 12 for $4.99. Splendid stream to be in attendance for. Sauron attacked my channel once again. May you guys continue to stream and post the power. Well, thank you. Let's see, is there anything else in the chat while you're looking that up, Logos? Bolshevik cosmonaut depends on which left. The financial bourgeoisie left, certainly not. The popular working class left, probably. We do get into that, so no worries there.
Yeah, I noticed some of that in the chat where people thought that we were talking about the left as a monolith, and I want to make it very super clear that the left is not a monolith. There are definitely different factions in the left. The Haas, Jimmy Dore, the joke is the Red Brown Alliance is what they call them, right? That part of the left is not the same as kind of like the woke capitalism left.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. So is that all you have, Logos?
Looking through, I mean, there's a lot of points I could bring up, but it would just be kind of tit for tat. I think people can just read what I've written if they're curious, and I think we're on a pretty good note to end it.
All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in, and don't forget, the next few days I'll be posting Logos' essay on Substack. So for more details, this is more of a summary, right? You can go into more detail on a written work. So it's Todd Lewis, Praise of Fly Podcast, signing off.